Okay, we are moving on, and I am so excited to be able to announce and introduce our next speaker, Tamika Fitzpatrick. Excuse me, let me try that again. Dr. Tamika Fitzpatrick is here to speak to us today about the 4As. And not only is she a colleague, she is an expert, and I have heard a little glimpse of this topic in our podcast, and I'm just thrilled to have her here today. So Dr. Fitzpatrick obtained her doctorate degree from the University of North Texas, where she served as a diversity scholar lecturer. She also served as an elementary classroom teacher, a professor online and traditional, a program chair, advanced ed chair, and a member of the board of trustees at the St. George's Independent School. Dr. Fitzpatrick enjoys contributing to the field of education by sharing information and resources with educational leaders and aims to promote continued growth dialogue and application of learning. And that is exactly what she is here to do today. I am so excited and honored to introduce and welcome Dr. Tamika Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Dr. Hield. I'm sorry. So I'm going to mention something. Dr. Hield said expert, and I will say one of the very first things I like to do whenever I begin a conversation is to kind of discuss some understandings. And so I love to say that while I am a doctor, I cannot write a prescription when it comes to these issues. And so what I want to do today really is just kind of share what my advocacy journey has looked like. Like so many people, I would imagine that the past few years has taught us all a lot about ourselves and our families and those around us. For example, I quickly realized over the course of this year that silence is actually really loud. Advocacy is important, and arguing will never again be my style. Now, please don't get me wrong. Once upon a time, arguing was just something that I did for sport. It was a hobby. I would argue with people, but I also recall being extremely entertained by the idea that even the most agreeable person would lose control if they failed to change someone else's mind about something that wouldn't even matter come tomorrow. So in the past few years, I realized again that silence is not just silence. When I say silence, I mean the mere act of not saying anything at all. But I also realized that it was almost worse than an actual argument. So over the course of the last year, we've had a couple of things that have become very traditional for us. For example, if you logged in and you couldn't hear me and you saw my mouth moving, you would probably think, oh, she must be on mute. So you see, in an argument, each person has a position that they feel strongly about. And often people climb a hill, they plant their flag, and they have no intention of having their minds changed. And oftentimes when we think about arguments, the best ways to avoid an argument or avoid having your mind changed is to be so far removed that you can't hear what the other person is saying. So when we think about an argument, it usually takes two people too. And that often means that the opponent has likely done the same thing. But when we think about life and we think about what a good argument is, it is clear where each person stands. But it also requires that we model civil discourse and that we argue a position rather than about a person. So in 2020, this phrase, "you're on mute," became the quote of the year. And not only was it a quote, it seemed to almost be a catchphrase. You'd often hear people use it in both professional and personal settings. And if you're like me and you try to have a family gathering over the holidays using Zoom, there were a lot of opportunities to say, hey, you're on mute. So what happens is, as we've moved from those face-to-face exchanges, the ways in which we are communicating has opened up. So when we think about the phrase, you're on mute, the phrase was often heard when others on a call expected to hear something from a particular person. And again, by all visual accounts, it may have looked like they were speaking. Perhaps their lips were moving or their facial expression changed. But because the intended audience could not hear the message, many would say in unison, "You're on mute." And that reminder to me that silence, it cannot go unnoticed. So the phrase also became very symbolic. When we say it's symbolic, it's symbolic for me because when others are expecting to hear from you, the silence does not go unnoticed. And so with that in mind, I wanted to be sure that my voice was actually delivering my intended message versus allowing my audience to form an assumption based on the meanings that they attach based on my silence. So I needed to reflect and find out where was the best place to start. So again, I mentioned civil discourse, and we're all privy to that idea. We know what civil discourse looks like. We're taught about respecting a person even if we disagree with their position. But I was interested in how to effectively communicate and advocate for an issue when others may have a different opinion. So I began with the first person that I control and the only person I can control, which is actually myself. So I began with self-reflection. I looked at, what is the intent of improving my self-awareness and my knowledge, not just what topics I was interested in, or not just the issues that people advocated for, but how do we actually advocate? So the actual process of using my voice in meaningful ways that make real and lasting meaningful changes. This required that I do the second thing there, that I listen and seek feedback to understand how differences shape our perspectives, our intent, and even our perception. So the pursuit of self-awareness, the listening and seeking feedback from others was actually really a really vital prerequisite before I could take any action. So I began my reflection with questions like, who am I, and what and where can I contribute? And recently, as Dr. Hill mentioned, I had the opportunity to share this work on the podcast, Early Childhood Chatter, with Dr. Shipley and Dr. Hill. And I discussed the 4 A's of advocacy. Those are advocacy, being aware, an ally, or an activist. And so today I just kind of want to briefly discuss 3 of those, which include ally, advocate, and activist. And so, we are all kind of venturing back out into the world. Those of you who are educators are going back into classrooms and working not just with your colleagues, but with the families and the students that you serve. And so we have lots of opportunities to advocate, not just for ourselves, but for those other people who make up our community. And so when we think of, this self-reflection piece, the first question I asked was, kind of where I am in this. And if you're wondering why that is important, it's important to know who we are, or in my case, who I am, in the context of what micro and macro cultures I belong to. So there are things that I want to be involved in that don't necessarily impact me directly. And in those cases, I can provide support for those people who are impacted. And in that providing support, I can be an ally. But there's also times when I'm an advocate for the things that personally impact me in the spaces and places where I can utilize my privilege. Now, a lot of people hear the word privilege and they say, I don't have any privileges, or privileges are something that other people have. But privilege is actually a really neat kind of concept, because I have privilege in situations where others like me may not even have access. For example, there's been a lot of attention, particularly in the field of education, related to the ways that people of color are seen in the curriculum or in textbooks. So when I say privilege, I have the privilege of participating in environments where both the curriculum and the revisions of the textbook are reviewed. So that gives me an opportunity to advocate for representation. So when we hear the term activism, a lot of times it's like, so how is advocacy different from activism? And one of the things that I found is, there's a need for both advocacy and activism. But because I'm in the environments where the decisions and the curriculum are made, I can work within the system to generate change because I can communicate directly with the decision makers. So I can both advocate for and communicate with decision makers, either proactively or reactively. So people will sometimes ask questions, well, doesn't everyone have the same opportunity to advocate? And in that case, I will say no. Successful advocacy is the ability to rely on relationships. So that relationship component is really important because you're relying on relationships, sound policy, and respect. And it's been my experience that when people don't have the relationships with the decision makers, they often feel the need to take a more direct action, such as protest. So activism often is the result of a lack of relationship, or when people feel like their advocacy efforts haven't been successful. So there really is a difference between activism and advocacy. And so I mentioned, this self-reflection piece that I went through. And so the past few years have really shed much needed light on not just the need of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also the benefits that those efforts can provide. And again, I mentioned the proactive versus the reactive, and preemptive advocacy is something that I can do via my teaching, my research, and my service. And so that is probably something that most of us can do, particularly if we are in positions of leadership. And when I say leadership, I'm not even just talking if you are the leader of a building, because we're actually leaders in our classroom, we're leaders in our community. It doesn't require an official title. But for me, this DEI focus serves as the foundation and the personally provides themes across all three categories for me. So it's also helped me decide where I wanted to further investigate to find out my personal why. And in doing that, I realized that one of the most pressing concerns that I had when it came to the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion actually had nothing to do with the issues themselves. It had more to do with the ineffective ways that we seem to be presenting our opposing views. So in reflection, it really seemed that when we feel strongly about something, we often expect others to immediately feel strongly about the same issue. And so I really had a question of why, and really reflecting even further to say, we want people to be as passionate about our issues as we are, but the question is, number one, why? And then the second part is, do they even know how? So as teachers and instructors or parents or just human beings, we're often told to consider our audience. And this sentiment also applies when we're talking about our advocacy work. So like me, you've probably witnessed people who argue for hours only to later discover that essentially they are seeking the same outcome. They're seeking the same change, but in a different place on their awareness journey. So our position in our awareness journey often impacts the action that we're going to take. So if someone's taken aback that a person is not instantly outraged by something that offends them on their awareness journey, in just a moment, I'm going to share a visual that can be a helpful reference. And I'll be sure to put this in the chat too. But as you look at this visual, this is something that as I share this work, I often say, my intent is not to give an opinion about the topics that people want to advocate for. Really, what I'm trying to do is just be sure that people are aware of where they can use their privilege and their voice. So it's not about, do I agree with the position that you are taking? It really is looking at visuals like this and finding, if I realize that the person that I'm trying to get on board is not as passionate about an issue as I am, it's important to find out where are they on their awareness journey. So you see there is unaware bystander. And sometimes we may see a problem that someone else has not yet even realize is a problem. And so I'll put this in the chat in just a little bit, but I found this to be extremely helpful because it really gives you an idea of, when you see inactivity on someone's part, does that mean that they are simply dismissing an issue for you? But again, I just really hope that from my sharing, you are collecting resources and having conversations that provide additional insight on how to avoid silence that is often speaking quite loudly, and that silence often cannot be undone. So in our classrooms, in our environments, if there are issues that people are expecting to hear from us on, simply not saying anything is probably sending a message that we don't intend. So I also hope you'll use this visual to better understand your own awareness journey and that of those around you so that you can impact real change on the issues that are important to you. If for some reason you feel like you don't have any opportunities to advocate for anything, I assure you that in our ever-changing society, particularly with children going back into schools and trying to really make up for what a lot of people see as a lost previous academic year, we will have several opportunities to advocate for ourselves and others. So one of the things that I did recently too was earned a DEI certificate and a badge from the University of South Florida. And when you earned the certificate, they gave you a Credly badge. And so, the Credly badge was for you to share on your social media that you had attended these sessions and you acquired that information. And at the end, you were given a certificate in this badge. And so when I think about this presentation, if I were to give you a badge, I'd want to share a badge that looks something like this with you. So we've all earned this at some point in time over the current year, be it professional or personally. We've been on calls where we've been the person to say, hey, I think you're on mute. But I do challenge you as you go forward in the next year, as you're meeting with people face-to-face, to see if you can work towards earning this badge in your face-to-face interactions, in your professional, in your personal interactions, but also within your community. Now, I'm married to an attorney, so I always have to give a disclaimer and say, please note the badge is for entertainment purposes only and not associated with any credentialing program. But I do hope that you will look at the original visual and see where you are on your awareness journey and where opportunities might lie, but also use it as you are communicating and learning with and from others. So thank you so much. If there are any questions, comments, or concerns, I'd love to chat with you.
Wow, Tamika, I have to tell you, throughout this entire year, I feel like I've grown so much as a professional, but also a person with reflection. So again, it just reminds us to be mindful of that as we go forward. There's a lot of accolades in the chat that we're seeing. Dr. Fitzpatrick will continue to kind of monitor the chat. Yeah, a lot of accolades. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. She will likely stay on here. Oh, perfect. She put her LinkedIn there. And then I am going to go ahead and I'm going to share the professional development certificate. Let's get that up. Let's see. Okay, so what you can see on the screen is the professional development certificate for this presentation. We want you to be able to take this with you. So please feel free to go ahead and take a snapshot of it or a screenshot of it, depending on what device you're on, but we will not be able to email this out. And just because we are going the entire day, we're not really able to track attendance with it. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat box, post it in the chat box for you, and then also give you about 4 or 5 minutes to go ahead and take a picture if you do not have access to it. So let's go ahead and do that. So Dr. Fitzpatrick, I do want to just end by thanking you for sharing your knowledge and just really allowing us to pause for a moment and think about our own personal reflection and growth in this area. So thank you so much. For those who are continuing on through the day, we have Scarlett Lewis next, and you will not want to miss her presentation.